Okay, we are trying to rush a little bit because I think we have a lot of questions for the panelists. And personally, it's a big honor to have all of them here today. I'm super excited and flattered. For all of you in the audience, if you have a tool everywhere, an app, you can have an interactive session. And there's also a small droid with us. Yeah, the GD2. He's going to be the main judge, so he's going to move around. So let's imagine this is the open source, and that is the not open source. And the droid is going to move around based on your feedback. Yeah, this is not. Okay, I'm going to be really quick to present. We are the San Francisco Computational Design Institute. We start as the Dynamo user group. So you can imagine I'm Alberto and also Cesar here. And we're going to alternate. Okay, this is the code. Really quick. It started at the beginning as the main question between profit and non-profit. Personally, as I'm passionate about software development, I would like to join, let's say, a startup, especially in San Francisco. This is kind of the environment. And I try to find a different business model that can be applied in order to have a community sharing data and sharing a good mindset. And so I try a different approach with a non-profit, and that's part of our institute. And as other panelists suggest, we try to change the topic in open source and not open source, because they actually embed the value of the non-profit itself. So as I see this is like choosing between love and money. And why this topic is really important right now. There is Microsoft that makes 60,000 patents available open source. If you're using Visual Studio Code, is also open source. They invested $7.5 billion in open source. They bought GitHub. And also Tesla, since we have Tesla, they devoted all our patents belong to you. So there is also a nice quote from the open source initiative. I don't think there could be any greater testament to maturity and success of open source software than only Microsoft recognition. So I have a question for all of you. How many years the open source initiative had? So if you want to answer, we can see the time. Okay. So actually you were close. I can wait a little bit. Yeah? Oh, no. Yeah. Okay, so it's more than 21 years, actually. This year is the 21st anniversary of the open source initiative, specifically. And that we want to share, so now the open source is allowed to drink with us here. So, this is how I see this different topic about open source and coding. I think software like visual programming, like Dynamo, Grasshopper, are these kind of old men that are looking at what's happening in the software industry from this small hole, basically. This is how Italy is. So it's the construction field where the old guy are actually looking at the other guy that are working really hard. And exactly as we said, we are really young, so comparing the comparison is like Grasshopper and Dynamo are really young compared to the mature open source with Python and other initiatives. So the main question that we are trying to ask is which path will you promote in the coming 365 days in your company? Are you going to be an advocate of open source? Are you going to do some initiative to spread the open source in your company or not? You keep developing yourself. It seems we all agree. Okay, I'll try to make it harder for them. This is how I see also the community in general and the relation with software company like Microsoft, you know, bias, and which part of the course you want to join. Okay, I divided in 6 different topics. I want to start with the personal, just to introduce the different panelists. And electric light did not come from the continuous improvement standard. So, what is your light bulb moment? You have the understanding that you need to apply a new paradigm shift, and you need to develop this as open source. And Dynamo is open source, the rest of them not. So, if one of you, if you want to introduce, I would like to introduce yourself.
So I'm just started out to take the same open that concept with you. So I'm going to show you. The only reason we didn't have an actual state discussion at this time. I started a company that's running up an architecture firm called Generative Technologies in my career's office. It was started in 2002. They sold in 2014. And we did both a kind of proprietary, very closed system that was based on the CATIA engine, and then subsequently more cloud-based things, more based on more open data and I guess more open source, although it really wasn't open source. What I think is interesting and what I'd like to go into this conversation too is that particularly people that come out of professional services companies like architects, but the whole discipline is exploding in terms of opportunities for monetizing and capitalizing innovation in ways that, again, if I can take it the old guard, you didn't have that opportunity. There wasn't this model of investment. There wasn't this flow of capital. And this really has only happened, I think, to the building industry in the last 3 to 5 years, that there's actual some venture interest coming into this market. And I think, again, maybe you're coming from more of the software and tech world, but if you're coming from the professional services world, I think it creates fascinating but unanswered questions about how you monetize and what you develop in your organizations. I'll say one more thing, which is I think it's kind of a 3-dimensional matrix, but I've meant the quadrant of the 3. One is open source versus proprietary technology, right? The second is profit versus non-profit, and the third is products versus services. So open source versus proprietary is not, I think, so much the idea that you're going to create technology and a billion people are going to help you build it. That isn't usually what the hallmark of open source, although this happens sometimes. It's that it's a service model masquerading as a product, right? You give the software away, people come to you for services to help you, and that's how you monetize it, right? When I look at the spectrum of interesting technologies that are coming out, a lot of them are single-person, individual developed technologies. Eve is actually a company, but Spec, right? This is one person looking for. So I'll shut down. I think that's the interesting problem. Is like, what do we do to monetize and to expand and create opportunities for what we create, and which sort of models are better to assist now? I think those are the questions people need to think about what they do.
Thank you so much. And again, we mentioned Speckle, and it's a great open source initiative. We have also the representative of BOM, that is one of the main projects in GitHub that has more than 60 collaborators for open source in our industry. I think it's great. If you want to talk about that.
I think open sourcing actually has an interesting kind of anthropological component here. People have to crowd around these projects and they learn the behaviors of open sourcing. When everything's out in the open, you're raising issues, you're learning how to merge branches, and all of those kind of behaviors that have to go along with open sourcing software. And I think also the choice to extend your intellectual property to a wider, richer community. And I think that's what the AECO industry needs. More minds gathered around projects. It's kind of an amazing conversation on everyone's been doing the same kind of interoperability tasks for the last decade. It's time that we all kind of move together.
You want to say that more?
Yeah. Oh no, we can skip one.
Well, I think feel comfortable sharing what you're doing and having a like-minded set of people that you find online or in person, places like this, versus finding something that you have created that you feel is confidential or proprietary and a benefit to you in some way for a business standpoint. So that's kind of, even that math open source versus closed or proprietary business model versus not. But I think it comes down to early people are excited about these ideas and they're willing to share. Later on, you get people that are more kind of mass market that say, what we have is interesting and we want to hold it off because that's valuable. But that's actually not necessarily true. Like, it's a false commodity that you have. So you actually benefit more, kind of like what Dennis was saying, by giving something away because that can come back and give you more value later. So I think those are kind of interesting models that come together. And it comes down to scarcity versus abundance. So the more you give away, the more value comes back to you.
And this connects really well with probably Zachary actually have done in the course of the past history. I'm pretty biased. I love Dino, but for the open source part and all the culture that it brings to us was a bridge to product, at least for me. So it was an entry level, so it can open the door. And this is just, I think we need to be mindful of this. We need to jump to the next step. In my opinion, as an industry, we need to have a lot of the skills. That's my point of view, but I want to challenge.
Well, so, I mean, I don't know if we've got a fair disclosure here, but the three of us worked very closely together for years on an open source project that we sort of all got to know each other on, which is Dynamo, and also connected technologies with. My name's Zachary, I work for Autodesk, been there for 12 years, former architect and designer before joining up. I think that the light bulb moment for me was definitely when there was an adjustment when I started working for Autodesk. I went from a situation where people say, so what did you do today? I say, well, I worked on this, and we were designing this, to going to a place where it sort of felt like I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. It's not that bad, but it was definitely an adjustment of working on proprietary software. I was working at it, and a lot of the things that we were working on a day-to-day basis were, for a number of financial reasons, things that you cannot easily talk to people about. You can set up all sorts of safe spaces for you to have conversations, and a lot of us are having these conversations here about sort of upcoming products and how much you can promise and how much you can't promise. And as soon as we started working on an open source project, it was just this transformative thing. It's like, oh, let me tell you what I worked on today. And I think that that's a fundamental difference, like on a very basic level about how you have conversations with people about what you do and what you're interested in. And there's all sorts of other reasons, and there's all sorts of other motivations that I think we're going to get into. But that was the big one for me, is it just made it easier to talk to people about what was important.
I would like to follow on that. So, briefly about sort of originally what I learned about it was sort of my practice with math skills, shepherded that thing into Autodesk. I'm going to play, I guess, maybe the pragmatist on this panel because, keying into what Zach said, yes, there was absolutely a difference in the way that open source kind of configured our conversation with customers and ways that we could talk about what we were building. But it turned out that it was just, it was kind of good business. So at the point at which we made Dynamo open source project inside of Autodesk, you might remember the way you would interact with Autodesk support is you'd go on a forum someplace and you'd ask a question. And may or may not get answered, and may or may not get referred to some technical people who could give you some technical responses. But that would take days or weeks, and you would wait until the next quarter, the next year to get a release that software might have some fix. That was the first time that you could directly interact with the developers who were building the thing, and it changed the way that we had technical conversations with people who wanted to use the software. So that was all happening at a time when some transition happened where open source suddenly became good business. Because it changed those kinds of business relationships in one way, and value became less about like being secretive and kind of holding on to all the things that you didn't want people to know about, and then surprise, here's all the cool stuff. And more about the value was in the constant conversation. Value was you would think that from day one, Dynamo was like outside contributors and everything else. No, it took 5 years for the first outside contributor in the Dynamo project. And some of that has to do with the fact that like just in AEC people didn't know what open source was and how to contribute and everything else. But some of it just also had to do with the fact. Well, I'll leave that there. There were a lot of reasons why that happened, but it's not like all happy bad you start an open source project. Oftentimes you have to pay the money to make that happen. But I'll make one other sort of differentiating business example why open source is increasingly becoming a good business idea, at least for those of us who have small software startups and trying to build this ecosystem of like very major players. And this might be uncomfortable because I'm not it helps to put our company in contrast to some of the software and platforms that people are currently being sold to other companies, which suggests that you have to be like locked in and building stuff on top of that platform with those technologies, so on and so forth. We've had very early engagements with customers that have said, we don't want to be locked in. We want to feel like, again, you're taking us along the journey, we're helping you to build and evolve this thing. That has value to us, that sort of transparency. So it's not just happy dappy and everything. There's value.
But also the whole, I don't know if you could have scaled Hyper that quickly without using the tools that, like, you didn't want to build web companies without using open source.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
It's the tooling and like the technologies you've used so far to get to where you are. If you didn't build it by yourself, how long would that take?
oh, yeah, and that is the other, exactly, so that's the other reason that some of this is good business sense, because you can accelerate the pace of your development, obviously using open source projects, and at the point at which you're using a lot of open source stuff to build your stuff, you really do feel like you need to contribute. You feel like, if I pull this thing off the shelf, because there's an open source project that can help me do this thing, it doesn't do this one thing quite right, but instead of building the version of that thing from scratch, I should contribute back to the project. And we've started doing that on several projects.
I can wrap up the first part just to interrupt a little bit.
This might be a loaded question, but how are you going to, what's the revenue model?
Well, so interestingly,
Let's connect to the next question. That's why I was wrapping up. No. It's just I want to wrap up the first argument. There was the light bulb moment. Sorry, and it was basically it seems to start from a really good. It seemed to start as a good social activity in the open source with resource value, transparency, but it turned out that actually is really good also for business. That's from the first part of the conversation. So how the open source is actually, how you can define an open source, what is an open source project. I don't know if everyone knows the difference between a free software and an open source one, and actually how this can be useful to run a business model. So that's perfect connect with Danny's question. So if you want to start with Hyper.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll answer your question pretty directly.
It's not a commercial for Hyper.
No. yeah. But it's a very interesting
This
question.
entire environment is a commercial.
because a lot
Thank you for coming. Come back.
of companies that have open source at their core they are faced with this issue. And one of those that I started using very early on in Dynamo, we put Dynamo on GitHub, and that was very young. Nobody knew what GitHub was. It just seemed like a good way to sort of work on your code. They have this model that you pay for privacy. Like the ethos behind that company and a lot of similar companies that are based on open source and have at the core of their sort of meaning is that this thing succeeds in growth of the community, and growth of the community is when people share. We support privacy and the need for people to keep their cards close to their chest, but you need to pay for that because that has value. And so Hyper can be very similar. You put functions on the platform, we'll execute them for free. The code is open source. And if you want privacy within your institution, that's fine. You pay.
So I guess this would crack into the question of what is open source in your model, but could I, as an external person, download Hyper, set up my own service, and do the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite cost reliability for the company, like the core library, which is a very small, simple thing at the heart of all the Hyper functions, is totally open source, and we're committed to making that And then there's a tie-in here, which we might get to later on. I won't go on too much about it, but there's open source and there's open standards. So open source is one piece about how you share, but open standards is another way in which you talk about how you're going to take the data that's generated by some of these frameworks that you use, and you're going to convey that around the larger system. So we've committed to both of those things, both open source and open standards.
I mean, I'm actually kind of curious to hear about how, why it makes sense for your Apple to sort of do it, because, I mean, for Autodesk, it's like, so we make Dynamo as a programming language, some of these things. It is not useful unless you use it in association with a bunch of other stuff that you pay for. It's a fancy calculator without, like, you can go and get all the open source stuff that's available. You can bring it down, you can have it on the machine, and you can do basic calculations. You can contract with Excel, or you can do some math. But it's sort of anchored in the fact that it adds value to other things that we do have as proprietary tools, and it adds value to those things. You buy them. So Ian's got a model for like actually providing software. Your Apple's got an anchor, I think, in we have open source, and it brings people in to understand that your Apple has another source of value that is something you charge for, and it is somewhat proprietary.
Right, yeah, I think the model's pretty interesting coming from a privately held engineering firm. So we chose to open source at the end of last year because our community had matured to the point where it was time to kind of expand that to the next level and open it up to our collaborators and competitors. So I think especially opening the interoperability pieces so that we don't need to talk about going from Rhino to Revit anymore. That close that conversation. So I think there was that aspect, but also being able to collaborate with other open source projects. So Dimitri's Speckle, whatever toolkit for that inside of BOM, Top Logic, so many other open source projects that we've been able to collaborate with as a result. And I think just opening that up and saying, hey, we're ready to move on to the next topic of conversation. Of course, there are pieces that are still on the closed source side that are still kind of in development, but I think just moving the conversation on is a really healthy thing to do. But also puts everyone in a vulnerable position at the same time.
Do you have other competitors that are using your tools?
Not that we know of openly, but I know that others have kind of looked at it and said, oh, that's kind of an interesting thing to do, but we're working on our own thing over here. And I think that's kind of been the level of conversation in the industry. We don't need to name names, but others saying, oh, we've got this great tool, but you can't have it. So I think kind of opening that up a bit has been really healthy and helpful.
What about on the employee side, like employee retention or mentoring or giving them a platform to kind of raise their professional visibility because they're developing these tools?
Sure, yeah, like Alberto mentioned, we have 60 people internally who are collaborating in BOM and also 5 external contributors to our open source project. And I think it does help to kind of have a transparency around the individuals whose minds are kind of porting into this thing versus the kind of closeness of proprietary tools.
So, just to wrap up, it seems also again that the business model is really useful, so the finance part. And yeah, we have another question, but there is a kind of topic also, the closed source, right? When you cannot access and understand what's going on behind. And this has an aspect I would like to say on magic, since we are in Vegas. So I have a kind of a trick here. So these aspects are the beauty also of the software. Like Dynamo, when you actually were on the plane with the Dynamo Magician, it will start all the conversation. This beauty with the sort of open source is the magic doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it exists because no one actually can understand all the code.
Magic doesn't exist
But how you correlate this connected to the business model? Like you don't have a surprise factor or wow factor because it's kind of transparent.
I don't think you need a surprise factor or a wow factor anymore. I mean, look, a lot of the demonstration that open source is good business is coming from outside of AEC, as it should, because how we're using it, how we're thinking about it, how we're even talking about software development is so small in comparison to the rest of the software world. The largest open source projects on GitHub right now are contributed to by by Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. And why do they do that? They do that because it's an accelerant, it's an advertisement. There's a lot of reasons they do that, but obviously they made decisions that are going to just drive, how open source gets used. And what happens then is it kind of trickles down into people's consciousness. A lot of people in AEC might have heard of open source, don't really know what it is, but they start hearing things like Microsoft acquires open source Linux provider Red Hat for $34 billion. And like, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
There must obviously be some value there. And then they come to us and they say, we hear you do this open source thing. What is open source like? So it kind of trickles down, and then it's gonna bubble back up. Like as those people report down to us that they're interested and they're thinking about it, we're gonna report back to them that it's like core of the mission.
It used to be antithetical. It was, if you're building a commercial viable business, then you have to have all of your IP closed. But it's a lot more common now than it was 15 years ago. How many of you are interested in the software side as opposed to anything else? So let's do something else. Because I'm interested in, very interested in the software, development of software and intellectual property, but I'm also intrigued by the development of other intellectual property, right? Including the conference today to see all of the stuff about modular construction going on, right? And there's IP being developed there, and tangible. But a lot of that could be. I mean, Brightonwood's, they open source some stuff this past summer that was their prism tool that's basically like all of their land planning IP that has less to do with the actual technical software, more to do with how would you build modular construction in London, which arguably has a lot of business value and could be, easily replicated in different environments. For example, the Skender thing, which is brilliant, seems to all center on this one piece. There's a piece of logic, but there's this connection, right? And it's intriguing to think about, could a company like that open source that connection, and what would that do to their business model? Would it accelerate it? Would it be giving the goods away? And even Factory OS is another example. What does the OS stand for? Is it operating system or is it open source? It could be both. They don't really know.
I think that's connected with the next.
Yeah, that's related to the next question. It's more related to the ethics and intellectual property. How do you guys see, is there a problem about protecting the work of those who provide open source? There's a perversive tendency not to recognize those who are the creators of the open source. What do we do about it, or what should change about that to make it better and recognize the contribution of people?
That comes down to the early innovators and kind of early adopters that are making things and spending nights and weekends building a tool. You have to freely give it away, but the ethos there is that when you freely give something away, especially from an open source licensing standpoint, you have to give attribution for it, and not it's like literally that graphic like right there. It's like yours is mine. This is mine now. So that's kind of a jerk move to do. It happens a lot.
Well, and it's also, for the most part, that is a violation of licensing agreements that usually people attach with open source agreements. So, the open source agreement is generally not like, here's this thing. You can, usually there's a byline like, read the fine print about what you can and cannot do with it, what you can and cannot say about it, and attribution. And there's many different licensing models for that, from saying you can use it, you don't need to tell anybody about it, to you can use it, but you need to attribute where it came from. And the diagram that you're showing here is sort of, well, it depends if that's okay or not, depending on the licensing agreement.
And I think, there are two licenses, right? There is the MIT and the Apache we can commercialize after, but there is also the GNU you cannot. So there are different kind of licensing systems that are really important to look in. But what kind of approach as a community we should embrace when we see this kind of violation of credit? Like this, for example, is a pufferfish from Michael Pryor, the work at Nike.
There should be public shaming on Twitter.
You public shaming? So we saw different approach. We see the public shame is one. We saw a curiosity-based approach, like you ask us question, and you see how they're going to reply. And this happened with another tool, Cove tool. And there is also another Gandhi approach that you don't interact in the social media, you try to interact behind the scene. So how how would you have maybe an organization that kind of take care of this, like Apple? They take care of all the packages or applications you submit.
This is such a kind of it's kind of a weird question. Like, how do you recognize the people? And I'm going to go back to the original question. How do you recognize and celebrate the people? Because I'm trying to think, like, you wouldn't know who I was were it not for Autodesk supporting Dynamo. It was a big corporate entity that allowed that dev team to exist, not really generating revenue, except what you could measure as the success in generating revenue for Revit. They allowed that to exist. So similarly in those other companies like Microsoft, Facebook, and everything else, the developers who are the maintainers of large open source projects get some credibility inside those software companies, because software companies kind of understand how to reward that. But I think your question is about, in our industry, how do you reward that? How do you reward the heroes, frankly, inside your Apple, who are saying, like, yeah, we'll put this thing out there, even though it has some sort of potential liability for us as a company, and really start to get the ball rolling on open source and AEC. Those firms that they work in have zero idea of how to reward them. Like, you know, you can't, I can't even imagine a conversation, and I've been in a lot of these conversations where some high up at a firm has identified some younger person who's working on an open source project or a grasshopper, you know, plugin or something, and said that person was an absolute hero in the community, and we should give them a huge raise and promotion and everything else, because no, it doesn't work like that, because they're all still like working inside projects. I don't know what the solution to that is. I mean, I guess the solution is to let some of those people who are doing that to turn you into a principal, and then you get it because you came up through it.
Well, I mean, you guys can probably speak to that as far as like, how has
Conrad.
it's dicey. You know, how have your employers rewarded or not rewarded an aspect of your contribution to open source communities?
So we are not part of HSK anymore, so are you talking about the San Francisco Dynamo Computational Design Institute?
You know, you guys have,
We promote a lot, like we have Danny and Dennis, they are good contributor to the open source, they work a lot in GitHub as well. We try to promote this kind of people. We try to have him join.
But don't we think that there's kind of a need to not have ego as a stake in the ground along with the open source project, and kind of let that go a little bit, because does it really matter if you get credit if everybody moves along faster?
I would argue that ego has to exist at some point. So if any of you read the Hackers Manifesto, it talks about how, and that's very early on in the history of open source, probably just pre-open source, where they talk about the whole reason that people started sharing software in the first place was because they wanted street cred. They wanted to show their friends like what they could do, and if that kernel of wanting to build something and say, hey, look, I remember Zach and I used to have conversations all the time. I'd be like, hey, you want to see something cool? It's like this feeling like, oh, we made something show up on the screen. It's like cool, and I don't think this has ever been done before. That's where those projects start. And certainly over time, to have them be managed well, I think you do have to have that sort of primary person step aside and have the thing turn into like something that can grow without that person. It's hard to have figureheads.
But they're not contradictory. Like they're not opposite ends. You can be altruistic and humble and still have ego. So you can provide value, give something away, but you're still recognizing some benefit for yourself. That's typically the only conversation, right? So Torvalds and
Well, he did win the Nobel Prize.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it starts. Where's your Nobel Prize? I mean, again, I think that the vast majority of open source initiatives that are not first and foremost product led are people who have something they believe is of value to a community, want to get it out there, want to orchestrate a community around it, quite frankly, you know, get the recognition just for doing that.
So,
And then I think, yeah, it turns into other things, hopefully later as this thing matures. You know, I do kind of have a foot in this now because I'm an academic and we generate tons of interesting projects and they all go on GitHub. And the problem with academic initiatives, which I think is a little bit like industry science, is that they live and die based on the interest of the kind of the principal originator, right? And it's very hard for these technologies to kind of flourish once that person drifts off, or so So I think that, you know, and to orchestrate a community typically takes money from a company, which is usually translated into yet another product or service that this is somehow enabled. So to crack that knot of again, if it's free for a reason, it's not for free, probably not open. Takes these kind of heroes who kind of just are doing it based on their interest, right? And what I think is remarkable is, you know, given the web, the cloud, is just how much efficacy one person can have in driving a project and driving adoption. But again, what happens to that technology after that person decides they want to use something?
Yeah.
Those are the hard transitions.
There is a really interesting topic, is the Web XR community. I don't know if you are aware of. They have a working group. So employer, Google, Apple, Safari, all the big company, actually allow one of the employer more to have 1 day a week to develop the community. That's what we have, at least in San Francisco. So they meet once a month to develop this framework that is the next Web 3D, and it's worldwide. They're meeting everywhere around the world, and they're coming in San Francisco, Seattle, all over the place. And everyone contribute to this open source project with this WebXR, and that's how Mozilla started as well, as an open source project.
And WebXR is a good example of when I was talking about open standards.
Yeah.
So it is open source in some parts, like the open source specifications and stuff, but that's an open standard, and the open standards are a slightly different discussion because the people who fly in to have those group meetings and everything else, and the people who are behind things like GLTF, or even IFC, are people who work for big companies who think that it's a business value to them to
But
have this.
is Autodesk not a big company?
No,
Because there is no one.
No, I think Autodesk has a slightly tortured relationship with open standards, which is now starting to change a little bit as they see like you just can't hold back. You can't hold back the tide, and the tide around things like WebXR, the tide around things like open standards like GLTF. Like there's so much industry investment in that, but you have to get involved.
Yeah.
You know, but for a long time that wasn't the case. For a long time you could have a walled garden, a very successful walled garden.
Shifting. The not open source is raising.
Coming back.
Okay. Yeah, this is a technical question about how. So when I was at Stanley Baum, I had this kind of message: Windows protect your PC, so Windows Defender, and there is the deployment process should be independently verifiable. So we have IT people that ask us as design technology if they can install or not different software. And so how we can cultivate a better open source culture in our industry, so to facilitate the integration of the software, technically speaking, how we can facilitate the access to open source, like I have an AECO file, an MSI, so this kind of, and how you can trust an open source project as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would take it back to, like, if you wanted to do a startup, you could probably build a workable product within a couple months, pulling libraries off the shelf that are trusted and verified, that you put together, wire together to stand up a product. That's pretty much what you guys did. But you did that because you knew how to build general software that could work together, and you trusted that each component that you were using was going to do its job.
Well, so I'm going to key back on something that Dennis was asking earlier. Is like, there's 5 people in here who care about the software stuff. Let's contextualize this for architects and engineers. Go back to your office after Autodesk University, take all the typical details that your company has developed over decades, and put them online. Make them available to all your competitors. And then set up a system so that they can contribute and move things around those details and suggest additions, and that you can collaborate together on those things. How many of you think that that would be realistic inside your firm? It's kind of like uneasy, like, oh, is that what open source is? Well, that is what open source is.
Well, but it also provokes the question of like, what's the value that your company is providing? Is the value that your company is providing? That's a great way to answer the question.
Yeah.
Would you guys ever do that?
Yeah, because you know
Are
how
you
often
differentiating yourselves based on your?
the thing that people don't understand about having worked with Autodesk is like Autodesk is an opportunity to be invited into hundreds and hundreds of people's offices and see how they work and see an intimate portrait into how people do And what you see is that people are doing exactly the same stuff in all the offices everywhere. And at some point, the software world said, boy, that's pretty stupid. We should start doing one thing in one place and collaborating on it together and using it as a community instead of like rebuilding the wheel.
It's not secret sauce. I mean, and actually getting back to like the Rhino Reddit interop question, like everybody would bring us in and be like, look at this thing we made. Like, I just saw 12 of those over the last month, so it's really not that competitive differentiator. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Just how many of you guys work in professional AEC companies and maybe comma or full stop, and then have some innovation that you're interested in figuring out what to do with? So that's the audience, right?
Yeah.
And I guess, I think, again, Gary Technologies was an interesting initiative, not because it was open source, but because we had methodologies and software that were developed by the company that we decided, that the partnership decided they were going to build a business around and actually give, sell, whatever to the community, to the competitor. I think you look at Construe, right? I mean, this is the really interesting kind of question. SOM, I forget the name of that first product that they built, but basically the lore is it got killed because it was successful, right? And the partnership decided this was a threat.
Yeah, the SOM draw.
Yeah, and I think, whether or not you took kind of the heart behind your question is not whether you give it away for free, but whether you enable your competitors and friends at all, right, with the stuff that you're doing. And I think that's it's an existential question for the industry, right? Because that has to somehow, as an industry, we have to make that happen, right? And open source, spinning off software companies, these are the models that we grasp for. But I think there's a ton of other intellectual property that there's no easy answer for that question, which is, for it to survive, it has to scale in a way that won't work if you hold it as a private asset for your company. But I think there are no easy answers yet to, there's no easy answer you can go to the principal and say, hey, this thing, everybody, people want it. If we just do X, it's going to help the partnership, right?
But that's where like the cultivation and of startups coming from a service industry model and spitting things out in a way that's like an incubator, cultivating the model. I mean, you guys have done some stuff in Atlanta. There's kind of a thriving startup community. Thornton Thomas said he's been doing some stuff. Construe is a good example of that. The idea of taking an IP that you develop internally, Burrow Apple, the same thing, and developing it into a product. So going from service to product and scaling a separate business out of it is actually more relevant to the AEC industry than the open source, closed source. It's more like, I have something interesting.
I think Kelly also can add a lot because it's a perfect example to run an open source project in an AEC company.
Yeah.
So maybe Kelly can.
So just to finish out that thought is how do we enable that more with a venture capital kind of community or some way to provide runway for things to be developed and provide a market opportunity. One of my first bosses in the Revit startup basically told me, like, what you want to do is come up with a business model that makes money while you're sleeping. Like, you don't want to provide tying your revenue to hourly billable rate is like a self-limiting function. So why do that? Why not do something that will scale? And that's kind of what we're talking about here too.
I think you brought up an interesting point about how do you trust an open source project, and I thought your example of typical details was a fun one, because how do you trust a typical detail? It's had so many hands on it throughout its life, and the kind of knowledge in the industry, is it ubiquitous at this point? Maybe, but I think that everyone's always going to have opinions about what exactly that should look like, and I think a lot of open source projects are exactly that. You need to see whose fingerprints have been on it, and then it's kind of your level of trust of that company or that person, and I think that that's a really interesting time that we're going to be looking at the individuals who have contributed to that and then deciding whether or not we trust it based on that.
It's an interesting thing because a sort of similar thing happens in the open source world. If you just take the example of UI frameworks for web development. Okay, these are the frameworks that developers use to make stuff show up in your web browser. There's this kind of like all these flame wars online about why this framework is better than this framework. And the reason all those frameworks have diverged over time is because communities have agreed that the principles of this one are better than the principles of this one are better than. So there's various communities supporting these different things. So to map it back to the sort of typical details, I'm sure there's any number of ways that you could detail some waterproofing condition on a roof, right? But it's probably a small number, the ways to do it right. And if that became a thing, like you could see communities evolving around like, no, this is the way to do it, no, this is the way. But they're all sort of equally valid, potentially. And that's what open source still exists. It's not like there's only one right solution and everybody has to use that solution.
I think the standard detail is actually an excellent example, business model aside, of, you would vet these things publicly, and they would become de facto standards. And regardless of, there'll be a lot of people's fingerprints on it, but eventually, it's kind of like a crowdsourcing version of getting the water. Can we open this up to,
So, we have the one final question. Yes, try to make it quick.
Yeah. What is the hackathons and meetups and learning communities are usually great spaces to stay in touch on what the people working and putting together projects, the challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis. Do you see better value on promoting this type of activities, how that relates to software development? Should the industry be doing more to promote this kind of activities? What's the value?
And I want to add also that Autodesk this year created the group network, and Rachel is here, to reach out to the community to find better hackathon, she was part of hackathon as well, forum and so on. So I think Autodesk also is moving in this direction, seizing value.
I can talk to that. I mean, so between the three of us, so when I was at Autodesk, I funded probably 15 different startups, and as far as hackathons and community efforts that had no intrinsic value to Autodesk, but they helped the community. And the reason for that was to develop the type of, that's kind of how we got Dynamo started. We kickstarted this effort and cultivated the next level of people that are building these tools by this focused effort of spending a weekend building something. There's a lot of value for building a community that way and building relationships between people that typically wouldn't be interacting at all.
And it's easy money in a lot of cases, how far does getting beer and pizza in a room in some place in the city and telling people about it go? It goes pretty far. There's all sorts of other things, sort of funding and cultivating giving people you guys did a great job of, publishing, here are a bunch of ways to do a meetup. I was just here's what you should do. You should email everybody, you should tell them what the agenda is. That sort of stuff is very helpful for people, and it doesn't cost anything once it's out there.
Yeah, and especially hackathons. I'm really passionate about this. We had a meetup this morning. Why all the other companies are actually paying people to go to hackathon, and we in our industry, we have to pay to go to hackathon. That's kind of the business model is not really clear for companies, especially for Autodesk, to actually pay people to come to hackathon and give $10,000 prize for 2 days hackathon. But in other industries,
well, that's a competition. There needs to be a clear deliverable. In robotics, there's pick and place kind of competitions where you all start with the same robot, you all start with the same problem you're trying to solve. So it's a clear metric. Did this one work better than that?
we can have clear metric in BIM as well. Why we don't create an automatic script that creates a sheet.
Well, I think if you tie it to something that is measurable, we actually have given prizes for best things, whatever. But if you make it more measurable and clear stakes, competitive instincts take over, and you will get more and more out of that.
Yeah, well, now we are opening the question to the public.
So I love the technical details example, and I think it's really relevant to a lot of people here. And I want to kind of bring it to other examples in the software idea. So like Dynamo, for example, or I'm assuming parts of BOM. We were talking all about things being fully open source and not fully open source. But oftentimes it's more like things are open source and then some things are privatized. So with regards to Dynamo, my understanding is that lots of companies have developed the extensions that they've decided, these extensions we're not going to release because that provides, for some reason, an advantage to us. And so they're participating in this open source project, in a private way. I think Ian, you just mentioned like, oh, it's actually kind of interesting that we decided, Hypar, to release the main engine as open source and available to everyone. How do you draw that line on like IP versus not, and open source parts that are community shareable and easy for, especially for an AEC company, that you have most people here, typical details, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, people would share all the typical details, and then someone would say, yeah, this is the typical detail, but like, here's the improvement we've made to it that we're not going to share. I don't know, how does that work?
I'll say one clarification real quick. Not all of Hyper is open source. I want you to get that. I mean, the stack that we build on top of the cloud is not open source. Just the library that is used to actually write functions and publish the cloud. It might be the future. Can't make any promises, but so I just wanted to clarify that. But I would say to the point about like how do you manage like private versus public versus open source versus that's two things. It's a design thing. You have to design your platform or your system so that you can have those components and they're separable so that people can have those things closed if they want to. And the reason, and then you also have to provide those tiers. You have to be able to have the thing be publicly available so the community can use it, but not necessarily open source. Because frankly, a lot of the community doesn't really care if they can see the source code anyways. They just want free software. Like, so give them a publicly available tool, but then some of them also want to actually contribute to that project. So then make it also so that if you think it's a good idea, they can contribute to that project as well.
There's also, oh yeah, I was
Sorry,
going to say the same thing.
I was going to say one other thing around why certain companies have some of these closed source things. And one example of this is like the geometry kernel that backs down. It's closed source because it's been something that Autodesk has been working on for decades, and it requires people with like PhDs in maths that I'll never understand to make those. It's expensive to develop a good geometry kernel. So, but Dynamo is built in a way such that the architecture supports just putting it on another, geometry kernel if you want to. And if the architecture didn't support that, it was all wound up together, then the sort of open sourcey nature of it would be even more suspect.
There's also just as a baseline, just to make sure people understand, I don't think that there's any, sort of closed source proprietary software out there that doesn't have open source components in it. I mean, there might be a few at this point.
You would be foolish to do that these days.
Yeah, well, but I mean, it's like Revit, the out-of-the-box sort of, functionality of it, even if you sort of exclude that Dynamo is now part of the functionality in terms of the out-of-the-box file, as well as Civil 3D, and Format, and Alias. It's got Avalon Edit is the text editing tool that is part of Revit. And if you go into the About Docs and you look through the licensing, you'll see that Avalon Edit is credited, and the licensing model is there, and it is an open source project that is other people can use. So that's it is not binary. Everything is totally sort of in the mix right now. It's just like what's the balance of it? So the AXM dependence, the geometry kernel dependence of the broadly open source tool that is done is just about sort of the weight of how much of the applications depend on other things.
But at the end of the day, you're probably just trying to get your job done. When you look at something like Grasshopper, there's a free thing that comes on top of Rhino that people can use to build their own software. It's not open source, but it's free. And the reason why it's free, people actually ask Bobby Neal that, is like, will you ever charge for Grasshopper? No. Why not? Because you need Rhino to run it, and you need to pay for Rhino to run it. So it's altruistic, it's self-fulfilling, and beneficial to have people, the bigger community of Grasshopper users there are, and sharing different graphs and definitions creates more value, and a tighter market for any of those things.
I mean, the free aspect of this, like free breadsticks at all environment.
Yeah.
It's not like you can just go by and get a handful of breadsticks.
I think again for service companies, the model is something like this. You give away something to the community in order to create a demand for expertise that your company has, right? And then you monetize the services, and that's the argument you have to bring to management, right? And I think it's a tough argument. It is, I think, particularly compelling if the people who can use your tool are not necessarily just your competitors, but things like others, right? I mean, if you can create kind of a demand or addiction for things that you guys provide. I mean, it's both marketing, but I think it's also, it's a gateway to services. And I think the I've come to the conclusion that academia is an open source model, because basically we give away the IP we generate, and we subsist on grants, right?
Well, but I mean, academia has taken a big step. I mean, like most universities at this point offer their courses online for free, with an idea of,
Most of them offer them for money too.
and they offer them for money, and the idea of like, why not get it?
So I think the difference between what is open source and what is closed source is more a question of what is ubiquitous at this point versus what are we still working on behind the scenes, or where exactly is the kind of valuable engineering know-how. Your Hubble does not employ any architects, so we knew that we needed to get other minds outside of your Hubble involved in the projects. So that was a huge benefit to open sourcing, is getting other people that we don't have internally kind of involved in the projects.
That's a really good point, because architects are far more likely to use bond and competing engineers, right? In fact, they probably do it already. Arab probably never.
Another question?
So we've been talking a lot about like companies and large entities being open source programs and other things. But what about individuals that are actually being contributors to open source platforms such as Dynamo with package developers, people that are putting in their own time on the weekends, that are uploading, and it's kind of like, yeah, they might get their name out there a little bit. It's not a big ego thing that a million people are using their package or something. Maybe it is, but it doesn't really come back to them that much. But they're spending a lot of their time developing these packages and stuff that's giving their creative edge over to everybody else that is now using that, and then they might be giving that credit back to them, but it still seemed like that person created something using those tools. What are your guys' kind of thoughts on like the smaller individuals that are starting to like develop these or contribute to the open source?
I mean, that just gets back to the same idea of scarcity versus abundance. You're like, you're going to give your nights and weekends because you're interested in the topic and you put something out there. Maybe it comes back and you set up a wiki page and people like what you're doing, or you see downloads, or there's some benefit that you see. But it's not monetary unless you set up a company around it.
Well, so it's not monetary, but I think one fundamental incentive that I've seen over the years for people just taking their own time to learn to code and develop stuff is that I think there's a certain breed of person that fundamentally dislikes toil. Well, yeah, all programmers, that's the famous thing about programmers, right? We're lazy. And so a lot of what people are building is just stuff that like takes all the toil out of their jobs. They want to go home and see their families and play. So it seems altruistic and everything else when they put this up on the package manager. It's like, I built this thing anyways because it, something that used to take 40 hours now takes 10 hours or 5 hours a minute. It might not be useful to the community, but it's certainly useful to me. But chances are, in our industry, especially at this point in time, if there's something that's very useful to you and reduces your toil, it's useful to somebody else.
I think that's a lot of,
Also, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's how the core computing stack was built, based on people who do these things for, exactly because they want to, because they get credit for doing it, for giving it away, and as an altruism, and at some level, why not, right? If your company's not going to monetize it.
I would put one caution in there about that model of contribution, and being, if you are the kind of person who is doing that kind of work, to be really clear about what the relationship is between the stuff that you're building as a contribution from your company versus it's a contribution of something that you've done at home on the weekend, on your own computer, on your own time. One of the things that we have seen is people who did those sorts of contributions, for instance, under the authentication mechanisms that are tied to their work email and authorization, and then they leave the company. And then there's and then it's, from a very sort of cut and dry way of looking at it, says like, that's not yours. That was a contribution that your company made, and it's tied to your company. And if you're doing it on events and weekends and it's at home and you consider it to be your own as part of your company, you need to sort of be really clear about where that separation occurs. It makes the conversations much easier later on.
No, it does. Part of the reason why I was asking this is you guys are like, well, Grasshopper's free, but the reason that it's free is because you need Rhino. The reason that Autodesk has supported Dynamo so much is because you need proprietary software. Like people that are the open source contributors to these, there's no proprietary software. They don't get anything back from it other than maybe learning themselves in the process of doing it. And
Well, they do. I mean, there's about 4 or 5 companies that I know that have started from hackathons or from these types of little packages or initiatives that are viable, ongoing concerns now.
and there's Parallel Studios, there's Bimorphs, and a couple others.
There is
And
Dynahub behind you. From Gita.
So I was talking to some of those guys this weekend actually, and they've started to now release paid things because they're like running out of. They're like, we don't make anything, like we don't make money by supporting all of this open source stuff that we have developed, and now we need to somehow turn that into a business model that we can make money. So they got a lot of free advertisement from it. And,
One thing to remember is just because you open source today's release doesn't mean you have to open source tomorrow's, right? So that is a path to, okay, so the performance stuff is free, everybody can still use it, but it becomes useless very quickly. So it is a path to kind of do something on your nights and weekends that might actually turn into a viable company in the future.
We haven't talked about data collection yet, but I'll just inject. There's one thing because it'll get people like, I've seen other aspects of that where people do the night weekend project and all the rest and stuff, and they're trying to sort of figure out how to make it worth their while. Many people have gone to the step of, if you want to come get the tools, it's free, you can come get it, you can download it, you can open source and all the rest. You need to put in your email address in order to do the download. Somebody's building a database of contacts. That's value, and that's a value to many kinds of businesses. You say, or that their software is instrumented that they're distributing, so they can know sort of what people are doing with it, where their potential customers are distributed throughout the country and the world. So there's lots of different things that people can get for the value for like their own individual application.
Well,
We need to wrap the session.
Yeah.
We're happy to continue the conversation afterwards. You have a closing remark?
yeah, no, I would like really to thank you, and I'm really sorry that this ended up like this. I would love to continue next year. I mean, I think there is a lot to talk about. There is a lot to talk about, and I would love to have more questions. So we try to find the winner between the two parts, this 0-1 binary thing that is not, but we know about that. So we want, of course, all the open source one. So in order to spread this initiative, we want to start this campaign also to come here next year to have the second round and to have a final kind of happy ending or continuous conversation. And basically, we want to give this to the community. So we want to have our 2D2 challenge. So we would like to have 365 pictures for every day, passing this toy to different people in the community. So you make a picture, you tag it, you put open source, you can put open SFCDI, and we want kind of diverse in the community. So a man should pass to a female and so on. So we want to have a kind of equity in this. If you find people from different countries, especially in the US, it's even better. We want to spread this around the communities and tag your friend. So this, I want to start since I'm a man with big baby.
So diverse.
Okay, I would really thank to all of you. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And again, thanks a lot for coming in, and hope you can spread the open source next year in your company and for customers.
Yeah, what about those? I want to see people start companies.
Yeah.
Why do you just say?
Good question.
Okay, session 2.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for tuning in to this open source conversation.
One of the founders from actually probably should have.
I try to be there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you can turn around the world, that's good.
Open source is one of the 5 people who throw open source.
I need a lot of.
Yeah, I think you are. Nice to meet you.
Keep informed. Vediamo
L'immagine dell'Umarell, bellissima. L'Umarell, il vecchio del cantiere.
Ah, sì, sì, sì. Italian culture. I think we're still live. Bye guys.
Interessante, guarda.
Do you want to interrupt the live? Is there, sorry.
You're next,
Yeah.